Good morning, Highlands Presbyterian, on May 15th, 2022. Beautiful day here in Columbus, and we are focused on the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus. And so we were last in the walk to Emmaus, road to Emmaus, 3 weeks ago when I last preached. And so this is from John 21. This is the first 14 verses of the 21st chapter of John. After this, Jesus revealed himself again to the disciples by the Sea of Tiberias, and he revealed himself in this way. Simon Peter, Thomas, called the twin, Nathanael of Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter said to them, "I am going fishing." They said to him, "We will go with you." They went out and got into the boat, but that night they caught nothing. Just as day was breaking, Jesus stood on the shore, yet the disciples did not know that it was Jesus. Jesus said to them, "Children, do you have any fish?" They answered him, "No." He said to them, "Cast the net on the right side of the boat. You will find some." So they cast it, and now they were not able to haul it in because of the quantity of fish. That disciple whom Jesus loved therefore said to Peter, "It is the Lord." When Simon Peter heard that it was the Lord, he put on his outer garment, for he was stripped for work, and threw himself into the sea. The other disciples came in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they were not far from the land, about 100 yards off. When they got out on land, they saw a charcoal fire in place, with fish laid out on it, and bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you have just caught." So Simon Peter went aboard and hauled the net ashore, full of large fish, 153 of them. And although there were so many, the net was not torn. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." Now none of the disciples dared to ask him, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came and took bread and gave it to them, and so with the fish. This was now the 3rd time that Jesus was revealed to the disciples after he was raised from the dead. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I just love in this, right, the richness of the imagery, right? So you have Peter who's stripped down for work, and then he realizes it's Jesus, so he puts on his clothes, jumps into the water, leaves everybody else behind, swims to shore, which is interesting when you think about this in comparison with Peter walking on water, right? Where as soon as he loses sight takes his eyes off Jesus, he begins to sink into the waves. But here he jumps into the water, swims to shore, and then leaves the others behind to drag in this net full of fish. And then when they get it there, Jesus tells them to go get some fish, and then Peter goes back and grabs some more. It's impulsive Peter, right? It's so real, right? These characters, we can relate to them, right? So the things we do without thinking. I love these and the details in here, right? There's 153 fish. Why are there 153 fish? Why did we note that, right? There's a couple different theories. I think one is probably because somebody counted, because it happened that way. And some say it's because, to represent 153 different kinds of people that the gospel brings in, representing the worldwide reach of the gospel. I like that. I don't know how scientifically based that is, but I think it's a good way to think about why were there 153 fish. So today we're going to talk about stories, right? Stories matter. Imagine that I was describing to you the scenes from this car chase about how someone was trying to get away and they were driving recklessly and banging into cars and causing all sorts of mayhem, right? It would really matter what the setting for that was. Did it happen in Columbus yesterday? Or is it the opening sequence of Fast and the Furious 17 or James Bond, one of those movies, right? You would really want to know the difference because it would greatly shape your follow-up questions, right? Because in the one hand, you'd say, "Oh, was anybody hurt?" Whereas in the other, you'd say, "Is it any good?" And, I'd say for the Fast and Furious movies, it's probably like all the ones beforehand. That's my, plane movies. When I'm on a plane, I watch stuff like that. It's mindless. And so stories, they change us, right? They affect how we feel about things, how we interpret things. And when stories change, right, it changes us as individuals and it changes us as society. And I think it's fascinating because we're in this great upheaval in terms of stories that we tell ourselves in this sort of postmodern society. It's marked by the loss of societal trust in big stories, meta-narratives, they call them, the big stories that explain who we are, where we came from, where we're going, how we're supposed to interact, right? We're losing communal trust and faith in those stories. And it's changing us. And so the question is, how will it change us? And we're seeing that unfold, but I think a lot of those questions are still open for interpretation and what the impacts are going to have on society. And I think about it from a Christian perspective, right? So much of the Western world, the development of it is intertwined, right, with the presence and guidance of Christianity. When we think about America and the Protestant work ethic, when we think about so many of the values that we have in society are rooted in Christian values about, the value of each individual person, and when we think about the way we treat one another. We think, so much of the abolition of the slave trade was driven by people whose values were rooted in their Christian faith, and who saw slavery as this terrible wrong that needs to be ended. And so they pushed for that. And just so much of society is undergirded by Christian values. And so the question that I have is as sort of the larger society loses trust in the Christian values underneath and discards those, is what happens to the societal norms that are built on top of that. Can they survive without the foundation? And I think we'll be watching closely as that happens. And as Christians, right, it's how do we remain active in society, influencing things towards grace and love and peace? And how do we continue to have that be part of our common story? Because today, right, the individual stories, they're far more curated, they're segmented, where people sort of choosing their own story, and a lot of times there's not a lot of overlap. It makes me think of how in marketing classes in business school, we talked about segments, and how businesses will segment people to target different segments based on sort of age and income and where people are in life. And they'll target their marketing towards people in that segment and tell a different story, so that as you hear the story from the marketing over and over, eventually you begin to weave that into your story, so their product becomes part of your story. And so that's what marketing is trying to do, is influence your story by relating to it and telling a similar story. But they segment that because not everything is relevant, right? The same thing isn't relevant to everyone. And we're getting to that point in society where it's far bigger than just marketing, but our stories are so different, right? And it shapes how we react to world news. Caleb was asking me the difference between Democrats and Republicans, and I was trying to summarize and say it's sort of the story that different parties tell about how government should be involved in people's lives, and there's merits to each side of the story, but it's a different story that shapes the way people see government, the way they react to governmental news and changes, right? Think about the potential overturning of Roe versus Wade, right, is likely shaped by the story about how government should be involved. And then, as we interpret that as Christians, it's shaped by, the story of how we think about life beginning and who the author of life is and how we understand that. Shapes how we react to that. I've always been challenged and made to think by the Catholic viewpoint on the seamless garment of life, which links the way we understand abortion and capital punishment, about social justice, about military action, and it challenges us to think about how our viewpoints affect every single life, how we value life, how we defend life. It's a big story, this idea of the seamless garment. It's one of these overarching narratives that interprets how we view every life, right? The way we value human life depends on the story that we tell ourselves about the world and the origin of the world, right? If we believe that we're some biological accident, that's some lucky stroke of evolutionary wonder taking place on the edge of a galaxy that formed by pure chance, right? It's hard to make a case human life should be valued and defended. Based on what? But if, on the other hand, right, we believe that the true story of the world is that it was created by a loving God who knits us together in the womb and will one day redeem the entire world and dwell with humankind in peace and in joy for all of time, right? Well, that changes the way we see the world. And it changes the way we see the people in it. If you look around and the people that are around you are going to be around you for billions of years to come, you'll treat them differently, right? What story do we tell ourselves about the world and the people in it? Right? And the reason to focus on this is that the gospel reading today is about what happens to a people when the story changes. Right? Jesus had appeared to the disciples a few times before this in John, but I think the disciples hadn't fully grasped the reality of the resurrection. Right? Jesus had spent 3 years telling them a story about how his life is a new chapter in the story God has been telling since the very beginning, that his life, his death, and ultimate resurrection will redefine and change the way that story is told. It will redefine our relationship with God and open this other new chapter of kingdom-oriented living. Right? But the reality of that is so far outside of what the disciples were expecting, what they were accustomed to hearing. Right? The first century disciples were certainly less scientific, but also probably less likely to believe that God would take on human form and walk among us, right? Remember, God's name alone was so holy that Jews wouldn't say it. And they wouldn't write out the whole thing. They would have this abbreviation to be safe. And so it was incredibly challenging for them to believe that God was walking among them. And they knew that people didn't rise from the dead, right? They knew that their whole lives. It's just not done. And so all the facts of Jesus' death were so challenging that they just couldn't believe in this new story. And so they went back to the old story. They defaulted back to what they knew, right? Peter decides to go fishing. Right? He's going back to his lifestyle. And others decide to join him, right? They don't know what comes next. And so they go back to an old story, right? We've all been there in some ways, that the world changes and we want to go back to our old story because it's comfortable, right? It's like that's what comfort food is, right? It takes us back to an earlier time when the stories were simpler, when things made sense. When I sit down and eat meatloaf, I think about eating my mother's meatloaf at our table. And life was easier then. It was simpler. And it's comforting to think of that time and sort of retreat back into that time when things made sense. And so that's sort of what the disciples are doing here in this story. I think what's funny, right, is they fail miserably. Right? They're out fishing all night and they catch 0 fish, right? I've had this experience of you go out fish for hours, you catch nothing. It's incredibly defeating because you know the fish are down there. And it's like, why will you not bite this hook? Why will you not jump into this net? It's incredibly frustrating. And the absolute worst question to ask at that time is, did you catch any fish? Right? Which is great, because what's the exact question that Jesus asks, right? Did you catch any fish? And you can almost hear the frustration. They're just like, no, we did not catch any fish. Thank you for reminding us of them. And what Jesus does is he tells them to move the nets over to the other side of the boat, which is a tremendously laborious process, right? These are weighted nets. It's not a simple act to just pick up a line and throw it over. But they do. And even though they don't realize that it's Jesus, but at that point the nets are straining so much, these 153 fish are filling the nets. And at that point they realize it's the Lord. Right, which is when Peter, puts on his clothes and jumps in the water, which, again, just a very funny image to me. Right, Jesus it's his works that affirm his identity. It's why he does miracles, right? Because it affirms that he is who he says that he is. He's demonstrating his power over nature, right? And so the disciples, they realize this and they put the pieces together. Right? And they realize they're living in a new story where death is not the end of things, but God has power over death. Right? And so this new story is now fixed in their hearts. Right? And they're no longer going to go back to this previous life where they were fishing for fish, but now, right, fishing for people. right? Transforming hearts and minds, going into the world and telling the story where death is not the end, and explaining, right, that it is truly this one big story that's rooted in Genesis and will go on forever. And it's our story, right? We are invited into it because God has come to transform our story, the way we think about a story, the way we understand ourselves, the way we understand where we came from and where we're going in our relationship with God. Right? Is that when you think about, right, when you think about life, everything you see it is through a lens of a story. So the disciples are inviting people and are tremendously successful to reframe that story in light of the eternal kingdom of God and God's love and mercy for them. Right, which is the same invitation that God makes to us, to reframe everything that we see and everything we do in light of the story of God's kingdom that will go on forever. In light of the hope of heaven that is set before you, how do you live today? Because everything we do today should be seen through the lens of that story, right? We tend to compartmentalize our lives and we think about Monday separately from Sunday. And the truth of the gospel, right, is that the story that we're hearing on Sundays should guide the rest of the week, right? And we tell ourselves the story. We immerse ourselves in it. It doesn't contain itself neatly to one corner of our lives. It's the big story through which we see everything, the gospel story. And so that's what the disciples catch today. And it's what we're invited into today. There's a couple other notes in here, right? One thing I think is, right, Jesus shows up to the disciples in the midst of their complete and utter failure, right? They'd caught 0 fish before he showed up. And only in following his direction, only in listening to his voice and doing what he says, do they catch anything, right? And so when we think about when we go out into the world, when we're telling others about the grace of God, right, we worry about failure. We worry that our efforts won't be enough. Right? But it's not our efforts that matter, right? It's what God does through us. When we're willing to listen to Jesus, God will do remarkable things. And even when we fail, Jesus still shows up and still does amazing things through us. Right? The story isn't about us as the main character. It's about Jesus as the main character, reaching out and inviting us into that story, warts and failures and all. So have some grace and do not be discouraged. And finally, right, we recognize the grace and the power of God. We recognize Jesus for who he is most fully when we dine together, right? John notes that no one dared to ask who Jesus was when they were gathered around the fire. They knew it was Jesus, right? It's interesting, though, that John puts this sentence in here because he's noting the presence and reality of doubt, right? It's present in the community, which is okay. People still come. But by being exposed to Jesus, by joining in meals together, they recognize the divinity of Jesus. They see him for who he is. Right? People still came, even when they doubted, to see what Jesus was going to do and say. But Jesus shows up despite the doubts, despite the failures. And when we sit down and eat together, right, we know most fully that Jesus is there. Right? In our shared meals, God shows up just like the road to Emmaus, right? In the breaking of bread, God was made known. And so I just invite you, right? Invite people to share a meal. Your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, right? Share a meal, because as you share a meal, you talk about life. And as you talk about life, you talk about stories. And stories matter, right? Because we tell our story in light of the overarching kingdom story. And so we tell our story, and there's threads of the gospel interwoven in everything we do and who we are. And so as we share that, we invite people to see the presence of God in those meals, and to reframe their story in light of a story of grace and love that overcomes death and gives us hope. Even if the other stories in the world are fraying and falling apart, there is one story that will go on forever. And so we tell our story in light of that, and we invite others to see their story in light of that bigger story. Thanks be to God.